In this video, we are going to be using maths, spreadsheets, graphs, nodal mapping, and actual original footage of me playing Hollow Knight for the first time in 2017 as evidence to test my theory. Silksong's difficulty level is actually closer to that of Hollow Knight's than what most think, and that is purely based on player perception, meaning players have forgotten what it's like to play Hollow Knight for the first time. Or for short, Silksong isn't harder than Hollow Knight. We will be using methodologies designers actually used in the games industry to balance games, but we are going to be doing it retroactively, of course. We're going to be looking at 3 key areas of the game, as well as some adjacent topics later on. Those key areas are bosses, of course, runbacks, and routes from bench to bench. To give an example, before we get into how the tools I'm using actually works, let's just take a quick look at the first likely boss encounters from both Hollow Knight and Silksong, comparing their difficulty. According to my balancing spreadsheet, Gruzmother has a difficulty of 9.3 and Mossmother has a difficulty of 11.2, meaning that purely based on numbers, Silksong's Mossmother is harder. Now, this probably doesn't mean much to you right now at all, so let's explain how we actually got those numbers. So to determine the difficulty of each enemy, including bosses, in the opening 10 or so hours of each game, I decided to look at enemies from the lens of avoiding damage, meaning how hard it is to not get hit, rather than how hard it is to actually kill them. Taking this to the logical extreme, an enemy with 1000 HP that doesn't attack or move is going to be infinitely easier to kill than a 1 HP enemy that is almost impossible to hit and does 5 damage. So using that extreme, basing the difficulty level on likelihood to get hit just makes sense. So how are we getting the numbers? For all enemies, I am using their health, size, damage, if they are flying, projectile, have protection, or are aggressive, and finally the number of moves they can use. Out of all the binary info, so the flying, projectile, and protection, and aggressive, flying is weighted the highest, as it makes enemies the most unpredictable, and therefore most likely to do damage to you. Regarding the differences in weighting between regular enemies and bosses' health is significantly less important than regular enemies' health, but their number of moves and damage are more important. This relates to the logical extreme I was talking about earlier, as the bigger the health pool, the less important that health pool actually is. So going back to Gruzmother and Mossmother, firstly, does anyone find it strange that in both games you have to kill a mother in order to progress? It's like the opposite of a superhero origin story. Anyway, the difficulty of Gruzmother was 9.3 and Mossmother was 11.2, with the main difference between the enemies is that Mossmother has an additional attack and just slightly more HP. Overall though, they are very similar. Now we aren't looking at runbacks for these two because they are right at the start of the game, but it should be noted that neither have close benches, but that is because they are expected to be beaten first try, to be fair. Now before we move on to other bosses, the reason why some of the footage might look a bit potatoey is because when I mentioned about having original footage from 2017, I am actually retrieving that footage from a long privated let's play I did of the entire game on my personal channel, where it looks like for some reason I recorded it in 720p. And also this footage very much makes me question if I had thumbs my entire life or whether it's just a recent development. Now I decided to use this footage over getting new footage, though there is a mixture of old and new in this video for Hollow Knight, because I think it would be helpful to see how a brand new player actually plays Hollow Knight for the first time. Now, if this video that you're watching now gets a ridiculous number of likes, let's say like 100 likes, I will reluctantly stick the Let's Play as unlisted and link it in the description and the comment section of this video if you want to torture yourself for some reason. Anyway, moving on to the next comparable bosses, we have Bell Beast and False Knight. False Knight's difficulty number, according to the spreadsheet, is 13.1, whereas Bell Beast slightly beats out False Knight with 14.2. Despite Bell Beast doing 2 damage instead of 1, and the significant decrease in importance towards health in bosses, False Knight's large health pool and large size does bring him closer to Bell Beast than what some might expect. Now regarding False Knight's health as well, just to be clear, this is removing all the hits to his exposed pig head as well, as the hits to it do take health from him, but it's quite a unique window of attack which isn't found as forgiving in almost any other bosses, so I just decided to remove it. Otherwise, the spreadsheet would probably tell us that False Knight would be more difficult than Bell Beast, which just isn't true. However, let's talk about runbacks. Bell Beast doesn't really have a runback, with just 1 encounter and Acnid, which gives us a difficulty of 5.1. Remember that regular enemies are weighted differently, so their difficulty might seem a little high, but they are relative to other regular enemies, not bosses. On the other hand, False Knight does have a more significant runback. 4 encounters, first with 2 Tick-Ticks and a Vengefly, then a Huskard, then 2 Husk Bullies and Leaping Husk, and then finally 2 Husk Hornheads and a Wandering Husk. This gives us a total for a run back of 42.6, which is actually one of the highest difficulty run backs in the entire first 10 hours in the game. For simplicity, we are going to keep 2 separate tallies. Silksong currently has 2 harder bosses and Hollow Knight has 1 harder run back. Moving on to the next set of bosses, both of these bosses aren't really bosses, more encounters to prove you understand the mechanics of the game before progressing. The Husk Guard and the, well, I just called him Big Ant Boy. The reason why I don't have a proper name for him is that he just doesn't appear in the Silksong Beast Journal. Big Ant Boy got a lot of coverage when the game released for being too difficult, so let's see the comparison. Big Ant Boy goes out with an 11.9, just a bit more difficult than Moss Mother but less difficult than Bell Beast, and Husk Guard comes out at 9.6, again just a bit more difficult than Gruz Mother but less difficult than False Knight. This right here, as well as another example that I will get onto later, is where numbers do kind of fail us a bit, which is fine. Games can't be quantified to the nth degree and there needs to be some subjectivity and other types of observations thrown into the mix. On paper, yeah, Big Ant Boy is only slightly more difficult, but at the same time, one of his attacks is undodgeable without an ability and requires an advanced mechanic, the parry, to avoid it without the dash. In my opinion, this puts him quite a bit higher than Husk Guard in terms of difficulty, but either way, regardless, it's 3-0 to Silksong in terms of difficulty. Regarding the run back, Big Ant Boy has literally no encounters to get to him. Husk Guard has 2, a Tick Tick and a Wandering Husk, and then 2 Wandering Husks, putting the total difficulty of that run back at 13.6. Having 2 pieces of data relating to run back should hopefully now give you a better gauge of the context between the numbers. So we have 3-0 in difficulty to Silksong for bosses and 2-0 in difficulty in run backs to Hollow Knight. Next bosses, we have Hornet from Hollow Knight and Lance from Silksong. Hornet has a difficulty of 14.4 and Lance has a difficulty of 22.7. They have almost the exact same health pool, so this comes down to the amount of damage, as Lance does 2 damage, whilst Hornet only does 1. The fact that Lance has protection with some of their moves, in that they parry and counter, and that Lance has 2 extra moves than Hornet. Additionally, there are modifiers for difficulty levels relating to the environment, as Lance has lava on either side of the fight, whilst Hornet's environment is contained. That boosts Lance's difficulty a bit. Regarding runbacks, yet again, Lance has no encounters on the way back to them. Hornet does, with 3 encounters and a total runback difficulty of 28.5. This puts boss difficulty 4-0 for Silksong and runback difficulty 3-0 to Hornet. Now up next, we get a bit muddy with our comparisons just because of the way Hollow Knight is paced out and the way Silksong is paced out. With Hollow Knight, you get a lot more non-boss enemies, whilst in Silksong it's kind of more boss after boss after boss. So yeah, up next we have to tackle non-boss boss enemies from Hollow Knight, being the first encounter with the Moss Charger, though it is different to other Moss Chargers, I will say, regarding its stats and variables. And we will have to compare it to the 4th chorus, just due to the placement in the games. Now, this isn't really much of a comparison. The 4th chorus obviously completely batters the boss Moss Charger, but in terms of where they are in the game, they are actually quite similarly placed, but in terms of time, geography, and what abilities the player will probably have. Runbacks are also identical, so boss difficulty is 5-0 to Silksong, whilst runback difficulty stays at 3-0 to Hollow Knight. Next up, yet again, because of the pacing, we have a bit of a mismatch, Soul Knight and Moorwing. Now, I will talk about Moorwing in a second, just because he's had such a spotlight on him, but yeah, Moorwing trumps Soul Knight, as Soul Knight isn't really a boss. It's very much like the Big Ant Boy, where it's just a kill room, just with one enemy that's kind of hard. Fun fact, in my Let's Play, the title of the video where Soul Knight was featured was Unfair Boss Fight. Little did I know what was going to come further on in the Sanctum. Similar story as to what we have been seeing. Runback exists for Soul Knight but doesn't exist for Moorwing, if you have the spawn point at the Chapel of the Reaper anyway, which is the closest spawn point to Moorwing. Soul Knight's runback difficulty is 17.6, just a bit more difficult than the Husk Guard runback. Same amount of encounters. It's just that you have to face a Soul Twister on your way, which by itself, along with the requirement for platforming, has a difficulty of 7.9. But yeah, 6-0 to Silksong for boss difficulty, of course, and 4-0 to Hollow Knight for runback difficulty. Now, regarding Moorwing, yeah, he's received a nerf. After the nerf, on his own, he has a difficulty of 17.1. which is lower than that of the 4th chorus and Lance. This is just simply down to the fact that he has less moves than Lance, and actually smaller health pool than even Lance, but definitely the 4th chorus. And his environment is incredibly safe. Additionally, the player can get aid to help them, which can make all the difference. Now, I do wish I got to Moorwing before the nerf to see what he was like, but sadly I did not. Right, this is the time where Hollow Knight fights back, in a big way, actually. On paper, we have 2 of the hardest fights in both games going head to head. for the first 8 bosses anyway. In the Hollow Knight corner, we have the Mantis Lords. By themselves, they have a difficulty of 12.3 each, but the fact that there are 3 of them, and combined with the small arena and spikes, this gives the total boss encounter a difficulty of 51.5. In the Silksong corner, we have Sister Splinter. Now, I know what you're going to say. This isn't the hardest boss fight in the first 8 boss encounters. We have Widow next. And I agree, her by herself isn't, but it's the adds that sway it. Sister Splinter herself has a difficulty of 22.5, with adds being on average between 2 and 3 Splinter Barks, and with the spikes environmental modifier, this puts her total difficulty at 39.8. Now, I will be first to admit, the numbers could be tuned slightly when considering regular enemies as adds, but I think we can all agree adds massively up the chance of getting hit and the reduction of health windows in any fight. But going back to the headline, the result of the battle between the Mantis Lords and Splinter Sister, Hollow Knight actually comes out on top for boss difficulty, resulting in still quite a hefty lead for Silksong at 6-1. The run back is laughably different for both of these yet again. Sister Splinter has no encounters at all. The Mantis Lords, based on my footage from 2017, so that means that there could be a closer bench but I just didn't find it in 2017, has 11 encounters, including Mantis Youths, Ablooms, Sporgs, and Fungified Husks, giving a total difficulty of 80 for the runback. Comparing to the closest runback in terms of difficulty so far, it's the False Knights at 42.4, meaning that it's twice as likely to get hit on your way back to fight the Mantis Lords than it is to fight the False Knight. So boss difficulty is 6-1 to Silksong, and runback difficulty is 5-0 to Hollow Knight. A double win for Hollow Knight in that round. Now, the final boss fight comparison we have to look over in this video is Soul Master from Hollow Knight and Widow from Silksong. I have found both of these with the same amount of abilities, and based on my Let's Play, about the same amount of hours into each game. Soul Master was around 10 hours, whilst Widow was around 9 hours. Widow comes out on top of this one with a difficulty of 32.8, as opposed to Soul Master's difficulty of just 18.9. They both have 2 phases, and actually Soul Master has the edge when it comes to number of moves and the fact that he flies, and the fact that he's bigger. But Widow has a much bigger health pool with 15 more health, has protection during a lot of their fights, and of course, like every boss apart from Moss Mother in Silksong, does 2 damage. Runbacks, yeah, Hollow Knight wins out on difficulty again with runback difficulty of 47.2, slightly beating out False Knight's runback with 7 encounters, including 3 Soul Twisters, a bunch of mistakes, and a heavy sentry right at the beginning. So to round out this section, we have a 7-1 victory in favour of Silksong for boss difficulty and a 6-0 victory in favour of Hollow Knight for runbacks based on the numbers. Just a few more bits of data regarding bosses to give a more rounded picture. Taking out non-boss boss fights, the average difficulty of just the bosses with no adds or runbacks is actually 20.5 for Silksong and 21.4 for Hollow Knight. Interesting. Okay, let's remove the 2 most difficult encounters. The new average is 18.5 for Silksong and 14 for Hollow Knight. Yeah, the Mantis Lords are bastards and 100% outliers. Right, so that rounds off the bosses and runbacks for the first 10 hours of both games. Clearly, according to the data, Silksong has harder boss fighters, though maybe not as hard as what people might think, and Hollow Knight has way harder runbacks because they actually exist in Hollow Knight. The reason why I'm focusing solely on the first 10 hours of each game is purely down to one thing. This video is all about understanding player perception, and if the numbers line up with that perception. Perception of a game is most likely to be determined within the first few hours of playing. Players form their opinion quickly, and that sets the tone for the rest. The problem with the comparison people have been making, in my opinion, is that for a lot of the vocal fanbase, their initial perception of Hollow Knight has been decaying in their brain for 8 years, making it more than likely wildly inaccurate in places. I think this video is uniquely positioned to give more context around the design changes between the 2 games because of a few reasons. We have actual live footage of a player, being me, who may or may not have had thumbs playing the game for the first time, and back then I was just an aspiring game designer. Now I am a game designer with 4 years experience in the industry. With that experience, I can use tools to take the data and paint a picture which is hopefully helpful for people to understand. Not only that, and now this is important, but Team Cherry might not have actually been trying to make a game that is similar in difficulty with Silksong. It is widely covered and publicised that Team Cherry couldn't figure out how to make DLC with Silksong. Now, this is not for technical reasons. They made DLC. They can actually make DLC. It's because of how wildly different the fundamentals of the game needed to be to suit Hornet as a character. But with that being said, what has remained from that DLC concept is clearly the notion of a continuation, whilst also giving players that similar experience they had when they first played Hollow Knight. A continuation in terms of pacing and difficulty rather than starting from scratch goes hand in hand with this aim, to give the player that experience again. I've mentioned many times my hypothesis on my lack of thumbs from looking back at the footage of me first playing Hollow Knight. The reason behind that, if you couldn't tell, is because I was unbelievably bad at Hollow Knight. Okay, did not mean to do that. Okay, I'm so bad. I meant to try and jump down and kill him, and I've just lost 3 hearts on one guy. Nice one. Yet there is now on your screen footage of me playing the game after, like many, playing the game for 8 years. Completing it time and time again, the difference is clearly stark. Players might feel like they want to experience Silksong and feel the same level of mastery immediately as they did in Hollow Knight, and whether that is actually true or not, it's my theory that Team Cherry just didn't want that for the player. Team Cherry only had so many levers to pull in order to give the player that same experience I'm referring to. Most of those levers result in increased consequences for failure, mainly the 2 damage bosses, but also harder platforming challenges with more spikes to set you back. One way I can see if this is actually the case is by going back in the data and rebalancing the bosses as if they were Hollow Knight bosses, which means simply just reducing the damage they output. So let's just do that. Let's go through the differences now. Moss Mother stays the same, as she only did 1 damage anyway, but Bell Beast is reduced to 12.2, now easier than False Knight's 13.1. Big Ant Boy is reduced to 9.9, still ahead but very close to the Huskar's 9.6. Lance is reduced to 16.9, again ahead of Hornet but only by 2.5 instead of 8.3. Fourth Chorus is reduced to 17.3, still of course beating Boss Moss Charger. Moorwing is reduced to 15.1, still beating Soul Knight by 4.4. Mantis Lords of course still win their fight, and the difference between Widow and Soulmaster is now only 4.5 instead of 13.9, with Widow having a difficulty of 21.4 and Soulmaster having a difficulty of 18.9. The score for boss difficulty would result in a slight change, from 7 to 1 to 6 to 2. Removing non-bosses and their counterparts would result in a 4-2 victory to Silksong, so much closer. If we keep the non-bosses removed and also remove the outlier comparison between the Mantis Lords and the Sister Splinter, the average difficulty with Silksong bosses now only dealing 1 damage is 15, and with Silksong's again, like I said before, being 14, which in the grand scheme of things is completely negligible. So basically, to summarize everything I've just said, the numbers back up player sentiment. Silksong bosses are harder than Hollow Knights, and based on the data, if Silksong bosses only dealt 1 damage, the difficulty would be near exactly the same, barring any outliers. Which also makes it clear to me this, as I said previously, Team Cherry pulled a lever to increase difficulty on purpose, and that lever was damage dealt. There are plenty of other changes, but one thing they wanted to make sure was that bosses punished mistakes, i.e. getting hit, harder than they did in Hornet. Which leads me on to the question, one which I've already half answered, is why? Well, let's take a look at the game through a different lens. What is obviously easier? What is obviously better and less frustrating? For one, retrieving your soul. In Hollow Knight, the Shade took 2 hits and fought back with both melee and projectiles. It would move, making it harder to hit, and it was aggressive. If it was an actual enemy, it would be around a 4 in difficulty, which is just easier than a Smelt Shoveler or a Fluttermite. In Silksong, you just hit your Cocoon of Silk once, and it doesn't move. It doesn't attack. This would be around a 0.4 difficulty enemy in comparison. Easier than the Moss Grub or a Crawlid. Another aspect of retrieving your soul, which is obviously easier looking at the data, is the runbacks to boss enemies. In Hollow Knight, almost every one of the 8 bosses you first come across has a runback, some with significant runbacks. In Silksong, almost all of them have none, or very minor runbacks for the first 8 bosses. So with one lever pulled in one direction being the boss difficulty and the punishment, a lever has been pulled in the other direction regarding the frustration of retrieving your soul, getting your currency back and making it back to the boss fight. Now let's take a look at another lever, platforming. Now platforming is much harder to quantify. You'd have to take into account distances, number of jumps, enemies and hazards, velocity of the player, etc. But I think we can all agree that not only is the platforming in Silksong harder than Hollow Knight, but it is harder quicker. The Hunter's March platforming challenge is as challenging as a second area of Green Path, if not more challenging. But you can get to Hunter's March much quicker. And not only can you, but you probably will based on how the game guides you. Another lever pulled in the opposite direction though is the introduction of crests, which change your downward pogo. So players can find a playstyle that suits them instead of having to deal with what the game wants them to do. And on top of that, the introduction of the clamber and the sprint jump gives the player even more control, freedom, and ways to save themselves. The fact that your second ability is more than likely going to be the skirt, which just nullifies a lot of the early platforming challenges, is another clear indicator that yes, They made something harder than Hollow Knight, but they also used tools and movement systems to make them easier as well. Regarding exploration, one lever pulled to make it easier in Silksong to explore is the fact that you can buy all maps and tools to make the map better all in one place. Visiting Chakra gives the player everything they need immediately. The lever pulled in the opposite direction though is that currency is a lot harder to find and harder to collect. Not all enemies give rosary beads, and rosary beads scatter a lot further on the ground, resulting in them being lost to spikes or down gaps often. Now, one thing we haven't touched on quite so much yet is basically anything outside of the bosses regarding enemy difficulty, something which is also important as bosses probably take up less than 5%, maybe 10% at a push of total playtime. Even though bosses will stick in the player's mind as something that sets the tone of their perspective across the whole game, the routes the players use to traverse the world are actually also incredibly important. Using the method we use for runbacks as well as a level design and balancing technique called nodal mapping, let's have a quick look at a few bench runs from both games and compare the difficulty. Now, bench runs meaning just simply running from bench to bench. Just as a quick explanation, nodal mapping is used primarily in linear games, very prevalent in action/adventure games or the FPS space, where level designers need to communicate, work together and design levels which flow nicely, have a good pace in terms of difficulty, but also fit into the overall difficulty curve of the game, as they might be designing level 12 out of 20 with no context on the level before them or after them. In practical terms, this involves drawing routes on a map and plotting out enemies which the player will face in their journey, which determines the difficulty. As an aside, nodal mapping is also used to balance resource economy. For example, plotting a route in a game like Doom, you should be able to estimate the amount of ammo required to kill all enemies, and also see how much ammo each enemy and each chest along the way drops to make sure that it has a good balance and the player doesn't run out of ammo. Anyway, let's take a look at bench runs, remembering that difficulty equals likelihood to get hit/punished and how bad that punishment is. We're going to be comparing runs in the Marrow to runs in Dirtmouth, runs in Farfield to runs in Greenpath, and runs in City of Tears to runs in Greymoor. So first run, starting in Bone Bottom to the Marrow, we have 5 encounters, 3 Skull Scuttler encounters, then 2 Beastfly encounters, with an average run difficulty of 4.1, and the most difficult enemy being the Beastfly, and the most difficult encounter being the Beastfly, which also involves platforming. Comparing to the first run starting in Dirtmouth to the Forgotten Crossroads that I did in Hollow Knight in 2017, we have many more encounters to find the first bench in the Forgotten Crossroads, 16 to be exact. This is to be expected as Forgotten Crossroads is designed to be more of a labyrinth, whilst the Marrow guides you in a very linear fashion to the first bench. To spare the details of every single encounter, we can jump to the average difficulty, which is 8.6, with the most difficult enemy being the Aspid Hunter, and the most difficult encounter being the Kill Room with 3 Aspid Hunters. For the next run, we look at Farfields, with a total of 5 encounters, 3 total encounters of Fetrids and Flapping Fetrids, sandwiching 2 encounters, one being a Scar Scout and the other being a Scar Scout and a Scar Stalker, with an average difficulty of 6.7, and the most difficult enemy being the Scar Stalker, and the most difficult combat encounter being the Scar Scout and Scar Stalker encounter at 17.3 difficulty level. To compare, let's look at a Greenpath run. We have 9 encounters, again with an average difficulty level of 6.7, with the hardest enemy being the volatile Mosskin and the most difficult encounter being 13.5, featuring an Obble, volatile Mosskin, and a Mosskin. So for this one, regarding the average difficulty for the entire run of From Bench to Bench, we actually have parity in difficulty. Moving on to the next run, we have another comparison between Farfields and Greenpath. In Greenpath, we have 7 encounters with an average difficulty of 8.3, with the hardest encounter actually being the first encounter at 13.6. In Farfields, we have 8 encounters, an average difficulty of just 3, due to it mainly being Fetrids, with the hardest encounter being encounter 7 at a difficulty of 12.9, all thanks to the Scar Scout. Moving on to the next 2 areas, Greymoor and City of Tears. This can get a similar part in both games in terms of playtime and abilities. Let's see how the nodal mapping looks. In the first run of Greymoor, we have 9 encounters with an average difficulty of 10.5, hardest encounter being a 16.8, being 2 Silk Snippers. In City of Tears, we have just 4 encounters with an average difficulty of 10.6, and the hardest encounter actually being a 27, involving a heap of enemies in very close quarters, including a Husk Dandy, Cowardly Husk, Gluttonous Husk, Wing Sentry, and the Great Huss Sentry. But yeah, average difficulty in Greymoor 10.5, average difficulty in City of Tears 10.6, pretty much exactly the same results. The second run in City of Tears, we just have 3 encounters this time, with an average difficulty of 13.4, with the hardest encounter being a difficulty level of 21, which consists of 2 Wing Sentries and 1 Land Sentry and involves platforming and spikes. In Greymoor, we have a run with just 2 encounters with an average difficulty of 12.6. With all that comparing, if we have a look and see what the difficulty is looking like on average for each area, this is what it looks like. The Marrow, 4.1 compared to Forgotten Crossroads, 8.6. Farfields, 4.85 with Green Path being 7.5. And Greymoor being 11.55 and City of Tears being 12. So according to these numbers, based on the length of paths between benches and the enemies the player will find along the way, especially early on, Hollow Knight actually has a higher difficulty level than Silksong. Now this is a process for balancing proactively, not something used as a post-mortem usually. And of course, once the game is out in the real world, players will go and find every which way to go, but the right way. You can guarantee that. And it's easy to look at all this which I've done and say, well, I just went this way, and it was actually harder than the way you just said, which is completely valid, which is why I use specifically benches as guiding posts from point to point. Just looking at the numbers, however, at the very least, it is clear to see that Silksong is 100% not massively more difficult than Hollow Knight when it comes to the majority of the minute-to-minute traversal from bench to bench. So with all that being said, with everything I've said in this video actually, I have a conclusion to my theory. To reiterate my theory, originally before investigating this matter further, I thought that the difficulty discourse of Silksong was entirely a perception issue. Players just didn't remember that Hollow Knight was difficult. Now the math has 100% proven that wrong with regards to the bosses, but shown that the theory is correct with regards to runbacks and routing. So with that, I now have a new statement to end the video on. Team Cherry wanted to make you feel like how you did when you first played Hollow Knight. In terms of the big challenges, the bosses, the remnant of Silksong being a DLC is that it's made for players who have played Hollow Knight, and the bosses are the biggest signpost of that remnant. They have done this almost entirely by increasing damage output to 2 damage for bosses. But alongside the increased consequence, they have made runbacks and bench-to-bench routing much easier. Is this the right call? Is building more walls for the players to overcome the right thing to do? Is designing a sequel to a game with the expectation that they played the first one also the right thing to do? Would it have been better to make the game feel as easy as it does for a seasoned Hollow Knight player starting up a new save on Hollow Knight? I think what I believe is that the design decisions they have made make sense for their assumed intention. Everything checks out on paper, but at the same time, the discourse around the difficulty also makes sense. When your answer to a design problem is to continuously interrupt the flow state through consistently high punishing bosses, then it will create frustration. What are your thoughts on all of this? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching this video. It's been a long one, and if you're new to the channel, I don't usually make content this long at all. But this has been a huge topic, of which I clocked around 80 hours to put this together in video form, which doesn't include my entire Hollow Knight playthrough from 2017. Honestly, it was such a stroke of luck that I stumbled across that for real. If you appreciate the effort, enjoyed the video, and found it useful or learned something, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel for more game design related videos. Anyway, again, thanks for watching and keep on keeping on.